Chapter 5 of Sister Dolorosa by James Lane Allen. This recording is in the public domain. Sleep gathers up the soft threads of passion that have been spun by us during the day, and weaves them into a tapestry of dreams on which we see the history of our own characters. We awake to find our wills more inextricably caught in the tissues of their own past. We stir and discover that we are the heirs of our dead selves of yesterday, with a large inheritance of transmitted purpose. When Gordon awoke the next morning, among his first thoughts was the idea of going on to join his friends that day, and this thought now caused him unexpected depression. Had he been older, he might have accepted this unwillingness to go away as the best reason for leaving. But young and habitually self-indulgent towards his desires when they were not connected with vice, he did not trouble himself with any forecast of consequences. "You ought not to go away to-day," the old housewife said to him in the morning, wishing to detain him through love of his company. "To-morrow will be Sunday, and you ought to go to Vespers and hear Sister Dolorosa sing. There is not such another voice in any convent in Kentucky." "I will stay," he replied quickly, and the next afternoon he was seated in the rear of the convent church, surrounded by rural Catholic worshippers who had assembled from the neighborhood. The entire front of the nave on one side was filled with the black-veiled Sisters of the Order, that on the other with the white-veiled novices, two far-journeying companies of consecrated souls who reminded him in the most solemn way how remote, how inaccessible was that young pilgrim among them of whom for a long time now he had been solely thinking. With these two companies of sacrificial souls before him, he understood her character in a new light. He beheld her much as a brave, beautiful boy volunteer who, suddenly waving a bright last adieu to gay companions in some gay-streeted town, from motives of the loftiest heroism, takes his place in the rear of passing soldiery, marching to misguided death; who from the rear, glowing with too impetuous ardor, makes his way from rank to rank, ever towards the front, and who at last, bearing the heavy arms and wearing the battle-stained uniform of a veteran, steps forward to the van at the commander's side and sets his fresh, pure face undaunted towards destruction. As he thought of her thus, deeper forces stirred within his nature than had ever been aroused by any other woman. In comparison, every one that he had known became for the moment commonplace. Human life as he was used to it gross and uninspiring, and his own ideal of duty a dwarfish mixture of selfishness and luxurious triviality. Impulsive in his recognition of nobleness of nature wherever he perceived it, for this devotedness of purpose he began to feel the emotion which, of all that ever visit the human heart, is at once the most humbling, the most uplifting, and the most enthralling, the hero-worship of a strong man for a fragile woman. The service began. As it went on, he noticed here and there among those near him such evidences of restlessness as betray in a seated throng high-wrought expectancy of some pleasure too long deferred. But at last these were succeeded by a breathless hush, as from the concealed organ-loft above a low minor prelude was heard, groping and striving nearer and nearer towards the concealed motive, as a little wave creeps farther and further along a melancholy shore. Suddenly, beautiful and clear, more tender than love, more sorrowful than death, there floated out upon the still air of the church the cry of a woman's soul that has offended, and that, shrinking from every prayer of speech, pours forth its more intense, inarticulate, and suffering need through the diviner faculty of song. At the sound every ear was strained to listen. Hitherto the wont had been to hear that voice bear aloft the common petition as calmly as the incense rose past the altar to the roof. But now it quivered over troubled depths of feeling. It rose freighted with the burden of self-accusal. Still higher and higher it rose, borne triumphantly upward by love and aspiration, until the power of the singer's frame seemed spending themselves in one superhuman effort of the soul to make its prayer understood to the divine forgiveness. Then all at once, at the highest note, as a bird soaring towards the sun has its wings broken by a shot from below, it too broke, faltered, and there was a silence. But only for a moment. Another voice, poor and cold, promptly finished the song. The service ended. The people poured out of the church. When Gordon came out, there were a few groups standing near the door talking. Others were already moving homeward across the grounds. Not far off he observed a lusty young countryman with a frank, winning face, who appeared to be waiting, while he held a child that had laid its bright head against his tanned, athletic neck. Gordon approached him and said with forced calmness, "Do you know what was the matter in the church?" "My wife has gone to see," he replied warmly. "Wait, she'll be here in a minute. Here she is now." The comely, Sunday-dressed young wife came up and took the child, who held out its arms fondly, smiling. She hadn't been well, and they didn't want her to sing to-day, but she begged to sing and broke down. Saying this, the young mother kissed her child, and slipping one hand into the great brown hand of her husband, which closed upon it, turned away with them across the lawn homeward. When Sister Dolorosa, who had passed a sleepless, prayerless night, stood in the organ loft and looked across the church at the scene of the Passion, at the shrine of the Virgin, at the white throng of novices and the dark throng of the Sisters, the common prayer of whom was to be borne upward by her voice, there came upon her like a burying wave a consciousness of how changed she was since she had stood there last. Thus, at the moment when Gordon, sitting below, reverently set her far above him, as one looks up to a statue whose feet are above the level of his head, she, thinking of what she had been and had now become, seemed to herself as though fallen from a white pedestal to the miry earth. But when, to a nature like hers, absolute loyalty to a sinless standard of character is the only law of happiness itself, every lapse into transgression is followed by an act of passionate self-chastisement, and by a more passionate outburst of love for the wronged ideal. And therefore scarce had she begun to sing, and in music to lift up the prayer she had denied herself in words, before the powers of her body succumbed, as the strings of an instrument snap under too strenuous a touch of the musician. Gordon walked out of the grounds beside the rustic young husband and wife, who plainly were lovers still. "The sister who sang has a beautiful voice," he said. "None of them can sing like her," replied the wife. "I love her better than any of the others." "I tin thing!" cried the little girl, looking at Gordon resentfully, as though he had denied her that accomplishment. "But you'll never sing in a convent, missy," cried the father, snatching her from her mother. "You'll sing for some man till he marries you as your mother did me. I was going to join the Trappist monks, but my wife said I was too good a sweetheart to spoil, and she had made up her mind to have me herself," he added, turning to Gordon with a laugh. "I'd have been a sister long ago if you hadn't begged and begged me not," was the reply, with the coquettish toss of a pretty head. "I done be tap monk," cried the little girl, looking at Gordon still more assertively, but joining in the laugh that followed with a scream of delight at the wisdom of her decision. Their paths here diverged, and Gordon walked slowly on alone, but not without turning to watch the retreating figures, his meeting with whom at such a moment formed an episode in the history of that passion under the influence of which he was now rapidly passing. For as he had sat in the church, his nature, which was always generous in its responsiveness, had lent itself wholly to the solicitations of the service; and for a time the stillness, the paintings portraying the divine sorrow, the slow procession of nameless women, the tapers, the incense, the hoary antiquity of the ceremonial, had carried him into a little-known region of his religious feeling. But from this he had been sharply recalled by the suggestion of a veiled personal tragedy close at hand in that unfinished song. His mood again became one of a vast pity for her, and issuing from the church with this feeling, there, near the very entrance, he had come upon a rustic picture of husband, wife, and child, with a sharpness of transition that had seemed the return of his spirit to its own world of flesh and blood. There, to him, was the poetry and the religion of life, the linked hands of lovers, the twining arms of childhood, health and joyousness, and a quiet walk over familiar fields in the evening air, from peaceful church to peaceful home. And so, thinking of this as he walked on alone, and thinking also of her, the two thoughts blended, and her image stood always before him in the pathway of his ideal future. The history of the next several days may soon be told. He wrote to his friends, stating that there was no game in the neighborhood, and that he had given up the idea of joining them and would return home. He took the letter to the station and waited for the train to pass southward, watching it rush away with a subtle pleasure at being left on the platform, as though the bridges were now burned behind him. Then he returned to the farmhouse, where Ezra met him with that look of stupid alarm which was natural to him whenever his few thoughts were agitated by a new situation of affairs. Word had come from the convent that he was wanted there to move a fence and make changes in the garden, and proud of the charge, he wished to go. But certain autumnal work in his own orchard and garden claimed his time, and hence the trouble. But Gordon, who henceforth had no reason for tarrying with the old couple, threw himself eagerly upon this opportunity to do so, and offered his aid in dispatching the tasks. So that thus a few days passed, during which he unconsciously made his way as far as any had ever done into the tortuous nature of the old man, who began to regard him with blind trustfulness. But they were restless, serious days. One after another passed, and he heard nothing of Sister Dolorosa. He asked himself whether she were ill, whether her visits to old Martha had been made to cease, and he shrank from the thought of bearing away into his life the haunting pain of such uncertainty. But some inner change constrained him no longer to call her name. As he sat with the old couple at night, the housewife renewed her talks with him, speaking sometimes of the convent and of Sister Dolorosa, the cessation of whose visits plainly gave her secret concern. But he listened in silence, preferring the privacy of his own thoughts. Sometimes, under feint of hunting, he would take his gun in the afternoon and stroll out over the country, but always the presence of the convent made itself felt over the landscape, dominating it, solitary and impregnable like a fortress. It began to draw his eyes with a species of fascination. He chafed against its assertion of barriers, and would have wished that his own will might be brought into conflict with it. It appeared to watch him, to have an eye at every window, to see in him a lurking danger. At other times, borne to him across the darkening fields, would come the sweet vesper bell, and in imagination he would see her entering the church amid the long procession of novices and nuns, her hands folded across her breast, her face full of the soft glories of the light that streamed in through the pictured windows. Over the fancied details of her life more and more fondly he lingered. And thus, although at first he had been interested in her wholly upon general grounds, believing her secretly unhappy, Thus, by thinking always of her and watching for her, and walking often beside her in his dreams, with the folly of the young, with the romantic ardor of his race, and as part of the never-ending blind tragedy of the world, he came at last to feel for her, among women, that passionate pain of yearning to know which is to know the sadness of love. Sleepless one night, he left the house after the old couple were asleep. The moon was shining, and unconsciously following the bent of his thoughts, he took the footpath that led across the fields. He passed the spot where he had first met her, and, absorbed in recollection of the scene, he walked on until before him the convent towered high in light and shadow. He had reached the entrance to the long avenue of elms. He traversed it, turned aside into the garden, and, following with many pauses around its borders, lived over again the day when she had led him through it. The mere sense of his greater physical nearness to her enthralled him. All her words came back. "These are daffodils. They bloomed in March long ago. And here are violets, which come in April." After a while, leaving the garden, he walked across the lawn to the church, and sat upon the steps, trying to look calmly at this whole episode in his life, and to summon resolution to bring it to an end. He dwelt particularly upon the hopelessness of his passion. He made himself believe that if he could but learn that she were not ill and suffering, if he could but see her once more and be very sure, he would go away, as every dictate of reason urged. Across the lawn stood the convent building. There caught his eye the faint glimmer of a light through a half-opened window, and while he looked he saw two of the nuns moving about within. Was some one dying? Was this light the taper of the dead? He tried to throw off a sudden weight of gloomy apprehension, and resolutely got up and walked away. But his purpose was formed not to leave until he had intelligence of her. One afternoon, a few days later, happening to come to an elevated point of the landscape, he saw her figure moving across the fields in the distance below him. Between the convent and the farmhouse, in one of the fields, there is a circular basin-like depression, and it was here, hidden from distant observation, with only the azure of the heavens above them, that their meeting took place. On the day when she had been his guide, he had told her that he was going away on the morrow, and as she walked along now, it might have been seen that she thought herself safe from intrusion. Her eyes were bent on the dust of the pathway. One hand was passing bead by bead upward along her rosary. Her veil was pushed back, so that between its black border and the glistening whiteness of her forehead there ran, like a rippling band of gold, the exposed edge of her shining hair. In the other hand she bore a large cluster of chrysanthemums, whose snow-white petals and green leaves formed a strong contrast with the crimson symbol that they partly framed against her sable bosom. He had come up close before the noise of his feet in the stubble drew her attention. Then she turned and saw him. But certain instincts of self-preservation act in women with lightning quickness. She did not recognize him, or give him time to recognize her. She merely turned again and walked onward at the same pace. But the chrysanthemums were trembling with the beating of her heart, and her eyes had in them that listening look with which one awaits the oncoming of danger from behind. But he had stopped. His nature was simple and trustful, and he had expected to renew his acquaintanceship at the point where it had ceased. When, therefore, she thus reminded him, as indeed she must, that there was no acquaintanceship between them, and that she regarded herself as much alone as though he were nowhere in sight, his feelings were arrested, as if frozen by her coldness. Still, it was for this chance that he had waited all these days. Another would not come, and whatever he wished to say to her must be said now. A sensitiveness wholly novel to his nature held him back, but a moment more and he was walking beside her. "I hope I do not intrude so very far," he said, in a tone of apology, but also of wounded self-respect. It was a difficult choice thus left to her. She could not say yes without seeming unpardonably rude. She could not say no without seeming to invite his presence. She walked on for a moment, and then, pausing, turned towards him. "Is there anything that you wish to ask me in regard to the convent?" This she said in the sweetest tone of apologetic courtesy, as though, in having thought only of herself at first, she had neglected some larger duty. If he had feared that he would see traces of physical suffering on her face, he was mistaken. She had forgotten to draw her veil close, and the sunlight fell upon its loveliness. Never had she been to him half so beautiful. Whatever expression her eyes had worn before he had come up, in them now rested only inscrutable calmness. "There is one thing I have wished very much to know," he answered, slowly, his eyes resting on hers. "I was at the church of the convent last Sunday and heard you sing. They said you were not well. I have hoped every day to hear that you were better. I have not cared to go away until I knew this." Scarcely had he begun when a flush dyed her face, her eyes fell, and she stood betrayed by the self-consciousness of what her own thoughts had that day been. One hand absently tore to pieces the blooms of the chrysanthemums, so that the petals fell down over her dark habit like snowflakes. But when he finished, she lifted her eyes again. "I am well now, thank you," she said, and the first smile that he had ever seen came forth from her soul to her face. But what a smile! It wrung his heart more than the sight of her tears could have done. "Then I shall hope to hear you sing again to morrow," he said quickly, for she seemed on the point of moving away. "I shall not sing to morrow," she replied a little hurriedly, with averted face, and again she started on. But he walked beside her. "In that case I have still to thank you for the pleasure I have had. I imagine that one would never do wrong if he could hear you sing whenever he is tempted," he said, looking sideways at her with a quiet, tentative smile. "It is not my voice," she replied more hurriedly. "It is the music of the service. Do not thank me. Thank God." "I have heard the service before. It was your voice that touched me." She drew her veil about her face and walked on in silence. "But I have no wish to say anything against your religion," he continued, his voice deepening and trembling. "If it has such power over the nature of women, if it lifts them to such ideals of duty, if it develops in them such characters, that merely to look into their faces, to be near them, to hear their voices, is to make a man think of a better world, I do not know why I should say anything against it." How often, without meaning it, our words are like a flight of arrows into another's heart. What he said but reminded her of her unfaithfulness. And therefore, while she revolved how, with perfect gentleness, she might ask him to allow her to continue her way alone, she did what she could. She spoke reverently, though all but inaudibly, in behalf of her order. "Our vows are perfect and divine. If they ever seem less, it is the fault of those of us who dishonor them." The acute self-reproach in her tone at once changed his mood. "On the other hand, I have also asked myself this question: Is it the creed that makes the natures of you women so beautiful, or is it the nature of woman that gives the beauty to the creed? It is not so with any other idea that women espouse? With any other cause that they undertake? Is it not so with anything that they spend their hearts upon, toil for, and sacrifice themselves for? Do I see any beauty in your vows except such as your life gives to them? I can believe it. I can believe that if you had never taken those vows, your life would still be beautiful. I can believe that you could change them for others and find yourself more nearly the woman that you strive to be, that you were meant to be." He spoke in the subdued voice with which one takes leave of some hope that brightens while it disappears. "I must ask you," she said, pausing, "I must ask you to allow me to continue my walk alone." And her voice quivered. He paused too, and stood looking into her eyes in silence with the thought that he should never see her again. The color had died out of his face. "I can never forgive your vows," he said, speaking very slowly and making an effort to appear unmoved. "I can never forgive your vows that they make it a sin for me to speak to you. I can never forgive them that they put between us a gulf that I cannot pass. Remember, I owe you a great deal. I owe you higher ideas of a woman's nature and a clearer resolution regarding my own life. Your vows, perhaps, make it even a sin that I should tell you this. But by what right? By what right am I forbidden to say that I shall remember you always, and that I shall carry away with me into my life " "Will you force me to turn back?" she asked in greater agitation. And though he could not see her face, he saw her tears fall upon her hands. "No," he answered sadly, "I shall not force you to turn back. I know that I have intruded. But it seemed that I could not go away without seeing you again, to be quite sure that you were well. And when I saw you, it seemed impossible not to speak of other things. Of course this must seem strange to you, stranger perhaps than I may imagine, since we look at human relationships so differently. My life in this world can be of no interest to you. You cannot therefore understand why yours should have any interest for me. Still, I hope you can forgive me," he added abruptly, turning his face away as it flushed and his voice faltered. She lifted her eyes quickly, although they were dim. "Do not ask me to forgive anything. There is nothing to be forgiven. It is I who must ask. Only leave me. Will you say good-bye to me?" And he held out his hand. She drew back, but overborne by emotion, he stepped forward, gently took her hand from the rosary, and held it in both his own. "Good-bye. But despite the cruel barriers that they have raised between us, I shall always " She foresaw what was coming. His manner told her that. She had not withdrawn her hand, but at this point she dropped the flowers that were in her other hand, laid it on her breast so that the longest finger pointed towards the symbol of the transfixed heart, and looked quickly at him with indescribable warning and distress. Then he released her, and she turned back towards the convent. "Mother," she said, with a frightened face, when she reached it, "I did not go to old Martha's. Some one was hunting in the fields, and I came back. Do not send me again, Mother, unless one of the Sisters goes with me." And with this half-truth on her lips, and full remorse for it in her heart, she passed into that deepening imperfection of nature which for the most of us makes up the inner world of reality. Gordon wrote to her that night. He had not foreseen his confession. It had been drawn from him under the influence of the moment. But since it was made, a sense of honor would not have allowed him to stop there, even had feeling carried him no further. Moreover, some hope had been born in him at the moment of separation, since she had not rebuked him, but only reminded him of her vows. His letter was full of the confidence and enthusiasm of youth, and its content may be understood by their likeness to others. He unfolded his plan of life, the life which he was asking her to share. He dwelt upon its possibilities, he pointed out the field of its aspirations. But he kept his letter for some days, unable to conceive a way by which it might be sent to its destination. At length the chance came in the simplest of disguises. Ezra was starting one morning to the convent. As he was leaving the room, old Martha called to him. She sat by the hearthstone with her head tied up in red flannel, and her large watery face flushed with pain, and pointed towards a basket of apples on the window-sill. "Take them to Sister Dolorosa, Ezra," she said. "Mind that you see her, and give them to her with your own hands. And ask her why she hasn't been to see me, and when she is coming." On this point her mind seemed more and more troubled. But what's the use of asking you to find out for me?" she added, flashing out at him with heroic anger. The old man stood in the middle of the room, dry and gnarled, his small eyes kindling into a dull rage at a taunt made in the presence of a guest whose good opinion he desired. But he took the apples in silence and left the room. As Gordon followed him beyond the garden, noting how his mind was absorbed in petty anger, a simple resolution came to him. "Ezra," he said, handing him the letter, "when you give the Sister the apples, deliver this. And we do not talk about business, you know, Ezra." The old man took the letter and put it furtively into his pocket, with a backward shake of his head towards the house. "Whatever risks I may have to run from other quarters, he will never tell her," Gordon said to himself. When Ezra returned in the evening, he was absorbed, and Gordon noted with relief that he was also unsuspicious. He walked some distance to meet the old man the next 2 days, and his suspense became almost unendurable, but he asked no questions. The third day Ezra drew from his pocket a letter, which he delivered, merely saying, "The Sister told me to give you this." Gordon soon turned aside across the fields, and having reached a point screened from observation, he opened the letter and read as follows: "I have received your letter. I have read it. But how could I listen to your proposal without becoming false to my vows? And if you knew that I had proved false to what I held most dear and binding, how could you ever believe that I would be true to anything else? Ah, no! Should you unite yourself to one who for your sake had been faithless to the ideal of womanhood which she regarded as supreme, you would soon withdraw from her the very love that she had sacrificed even her hopes of heaven to enjoy. But it seems possible that in writing to me you believe my vows no longer precious to my heart and sacred to my conscience. You are wrong. They are more dear to me at this moment than ever before, because at this moment, as never before, they give me a mournful admonition of my failure to exhibit to the world in my own life the beauty of their ineffable holiness. For had there not been something within me to lead you on, had I shown to you the sinless nature which it is their office to create, you would never have felt towards me as you do. You would no more have thought of loving me than of loving an angel of God. The least reparation I can make for my offense is to tell you that in offering me your love, you offer me the cup of sacred humiliation, and that I thank you for reminding me of my duty while I drain it to the dregs. After long deliberation, I have written to tell you this. And if it be allowed me to make one request, I would entreat that you will never lay this sin of mine to the charge of my religion and my order. We shall never meet again. Although I may not listen to your proposal, it is allowed me to love you as one of the works of God. And since there are exalted women in the world who do not consecrate themselves to the Church, I shall pray that you may find one of these to walk by your side through life. I will pray that she may be worthy of you, and perhaps you will teach her sometimes to pray for one who will always need her prayers. I only know that God orders our lives according to His goodness. My feet He set in one path of duty, yours in another, and He had separated us forever long before He allowed us to meet. If therefore, having thus separated us, He yet brought us together, only that we should thus know each other and then be parted, I cannot believe that there was not in it some needed lesson for us both. At least, if He will deign to hear the ceaseless, fervent petition of one so erring, He will not leave you unhappy on account of that love for me, which in this world it will never be allowed me to return. Farewell." The first part of this letter awakened in Gordon keen remorse and a faltering of purpose, but the latter filled him with a joy that excluded every other feeling. "She loves me!" he exclaimed. And as though registering a vow, he added aloud, "And nothing, God help me, nothing shall keep us apart." Walking to a point of the landscape that commanded a view of the convent, He remained there while the twilight fell, revolving how he was to surmount the remaining barriers between them, for these now seemed hardly more than cobwebs to be brushed aside by his hand. And often, meanwhile, he looked towards the convent, as one might look longingly towards some forbidden shrine, which the coming night would enable him to approach. Chapter 6. Chapters 6 and 7 of Sister Dolorosa by James Lane Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. A night for love it was. The great sun at setting had looked with steadfast eye at the convent standing lonely on its wide landscape, and had then thrown his final glance across the world towards the east. And the moon had quickly risen and hung about it the long silvery twilight of her heavenly watchfulness. The summer, too, which had been moving southward, now came slowly back, borne on warm airs that fanned the convent walls and sighed to its chaste lattices with the poetry of dead flowers and vanished songsters. But sighed in vain. With many a prayer, with many a cross on pure brow and shoulder and breast, with many a pious kiss of crucifix, the convent slept. Only some little novice, lying like a flushed figure of sleep on a couch of snow, may have stirred to draw one sigh, as those zephyrs, toying with her warm hair, broke some earthly dream of too much tenderness. Or they may merely have cooled the feverish feet of a withered nun, who clasped her dry hands in ecstasy, as on her cavernous eyes there dawned a vision of the glories and rewards of Paradise. But no, not all slept. At an open window on the eastern side of the convent stood the sleepless one, looking out into the largeness of the night, like one who is lost in the largeness of her sorrow. Across the lawn, a little distance off, stood the church of the convent. The moonlight rested on it like a smile of peace, the elms blessed it with tireless arms, and from the zenith of the sky down to the horizon there rested on outstretched wings, rank above rank and pinion brushing pinion, a host of white angelic cloud shape, as though guarding the sacred portal. But she looked at it with timid yearning. Greater and greater had become the need to pour into some ear a confession and a prayer for pardon. Her peace was gone. She had been concealing her heart from the Mother Superior. She had sinned against her vows. She had impiously offended the Divine Mother. And to-day, after answering his letter in order that she might defend her religion, she had acknowledged to her heart that she loved him. But they would never meet again. To-morrow she would make a full confession of what had taken place. Beyond that miserable ordeal she dared not gaze into her own future. Lost in the fears and sorrows of such thoughts, long she stood looking out into the night, stricken with a sense of alienation from human sympathy. She felt that she stood henceforth estranged from the entire convent, Mother Superior, novice and nun, as an object of reproach and of suffering into which no one of them could enter. Sorer yet grew her need, and a little way across the lawn stood the church, peaceful in the moonlight. Ah, the divine pity! If only she might steal first alone to the shrine of her whom most she had offended, and to an ear gracious to sorrow make confession of her frailty. At length, overcome with this desire, and gliding noiselessly out of the room, she passed down the moonlit hall, on each side of which the nuns were sleeping. She descended the stairway, took from the wall the key of the church, and then softly opening the door, stepped out into the night. For a moment she paused, icy and faint with physical fear. Then, passing like a swift shadow across the silvered lawn, she went round to the side entrance of the church, unlocked the door, and, entering quickly, locked herself inside. There she stood for some time with hands pressed tightly to her fluttering heart, until bodily agitation died away before the recollection of her mission. And there came upon her that calmness with which the soul enacts great tragedies. Then slowly, very slowly, hidden now, and now visible where the moonlight entered the long Gothic windows, she passed across the chancel towards the shrine of one whom ancestral faith had taught her to believe divine; and before the image of a Jewish woman, who herself in full humanity loved and married a carpenter nearly 2,000 years ago, living beside him as blameless wife and becoming blameless mother to his children, this poor child, whose nature was unstained as snow on the mountain peaks, poured out her prayer to be forgiven the sin of her love. To the woman of the world, the approaches of whose nature are defended by the intricacies of wilfulness and the barriers of deliberate reserve, to the woman of the world, who curbs and conceals that feeling to which she intends to yield herself in the end, it may seem incredible that there should have rooted itself so easily in the breast of one of her sex this flower of a fatal passion. But it should be remembered how unbefriended that bosom had been by any outpost of feminine self-consciousness, how exposed it was through very belief in its unearthly consecration, how like some unwashed vase that had long been collecting the sweet dews and rains of heaven, it had been silently filling with those unbidden intimations that are shed from above as the best gifts of womanhood. Moreover, her life was unspeakably isolate. In the monotony of its routine, a trifling event became an epoch. A fresh impression stirred within the mind, material for a chapter of history. Lifted far above commonplace psychology of the passions, however, was the planting and the growth of an emotion in a heart like hers. Her prayer began. It began with the scene of her first meeting with him in the fields, for from that moment she fixed the origin of her unfaithfulness. Of the entire hidden life of poetic reverie and unsatisfied desires which she had been living before, her innocent soul took no account. Therefore, beginning with that afternoon, she passed in review the history of her thoughts and feelings. The moon outside, flooding the heavens with its beams, was not so intense a lamp as memory now turned upon the recesses of her mind. Nothing escaped detection. His words, the scenes with him in the garden, in the field, his voice, looks, gestures, his anxiety and sympathy, his passionate letter, all were now vividly recalled, that they might be forgotten; and their influence confessed that it might forever be renounced. Her conscience stood beside her love as though it were some great, fast-growing, deadly plant in her heart, with deep twisted roots and strangling tendrils, each of which to the smallest fibre must be uptorn, so that not a germ should be left. But who can describe the prayer of such a soul? It is easy to ask to be rid of ignoble passions. They come upon us as momentary temptations, and are abhorrent to our better selves. But of all tragedies enacted within the theatre of the human mind, what one is so pitiful as that in which a pure being prays to be forgiven the one feeling of nature that is the revelation of beauty, the secret of perfection, the solace of the world, and the condition of immortality? The passing of such a tragedy scars the nature of the penitent like the passing of an age across a mountain rock. If there had lingered thus long on Sister Dolorosa's nature any upland of childhood's snows, these vanished in that hour. If any vernal belt of maidenhood, it felt the hot breath of that experience of the world and of the human destiny which quickly ages whatever it does not destroy. So that, while she prayed, there seemed to rise from within her and take flight forever that spotless image of herself as she once had been, and in its place to stand the form of a woman, older, altered, and set apart by sorrow. At length her prayer ended, and she rose. It had not brought her the peace that prayer brings to women; for the confession of her love before the very altar, the mere coming into audience with the Eternal to renounce it, had set upon it the seal of irrevocable truth. It is when the victim is led to the altar of sacrifice that it turns its piteous eyes upon the sacrificing hand and utters its poor dumb cry for life. And it was when Sister Dolorosa bared the breast of her humanity that it might be stabbed by the hand of her religion, that she too, though attempting to bless the stroke, felt the last pangs of that deep thrust. With such a wound she turned from the altar, walked with bowed head once more across the church, unlocked the door, stepped forth and locked it. The night had grown more tender. The hosts of seraphic cloud forms had fled across the sky, and as she turned her eyes upward to the heavens, there looked down upon her from their serene, untroubled heights only the stars that never falter or digress from their forewritten courses. The thought came to her that never henceforth should she look up to them without being reminded of how her own will had wandered from its orbit. The moon rained its steady beams upon the symbol of the Sacred Heart on her bosom until it seemed to throb again with the agony of the crucifixion. Never again should she see it without the remembrance that her sin had also pierced it afresh. With what loneliness that sin had surrounded her! As she had issued from the damp, chill atmosphere of the church, the warm airs of the south quickened within her long sleeping memories, and with the yearning of stricken childhood she thought of her mother, to whom she had turned of yore for sympathy. But that mother's bosom was now a mound of dust. She looked across the lawn towards the convent where the Mother Superior and the nuns were sleeping. To-morrow she would stand among them a greater alien than any stranger. No, she was alone. Among the millions of human beings on the earth of God there was not one on whose heart she could have rested her own. Not one save Him whose love had broken down all barriers that it might reach and enfold her. And Him she had repelled. A joy, new and indescribable, leaped within her that for Him and not for another she suffered and was bound in this tragedy of her fall. Slowly she took her way along the side of the church towards the front entrance, from which a paved walk led to the convent building. She reached the corner, she turned, and then she paused as one might pause who had come upon the beloved dead returned to life. For he was sitting on the steps of the church, leaning against one of the pillars, his face lifted upward so that the moonlight fell upon it. She had no time to turn back before he saw her. With a low cry of surprise and joy he sprang up and followed along the side of the church, for she had begun to retrace her steps to the door to lock herself inside. When he came up beside her, she paused. Both were trembling. But when he saw the look of suffering on her face, acting upon the impulse which had always impelled him to stand between her and unhappiness, he now took both of her hands. "Pauline!" He spoke with all the pleading love, all the depth of nature that was in him. She had attempted to withdraw her hands, but at the sound of that once familiar name she suddenly bowed her head as the wave of memories and emotions passed over her. Then he quickly put his arms around her, drew her to him, and bent down and kissed her. Chapter 7. For hours there lasted an interview during which he, with the delirium of hope, she with the delirium of despair, drained at their young lips that cup of life which is full of the first confession of love. In recollection so overwhelming did this meeting leave Gordon on the next morning that he was unmindful of everything beside, and among the consequences of absent-mindedness was the wound that he gave himself by the careless handling of his gun. When Ezra had set out for the convent that morning, he had walked with him, saying that he would go to the station for a daily paper, but chiefly wishing to escape the house and be alone. They had reached in the fields a rotting fence, on each side of which grew briars and underwood. He had expected to climb this fence, and as he stood beside it, speaking a few parting words to Ezra, he absently thrust his gun between two of the lower rails, not noticing that the lock was sprung. Caught in the brush on the other side, it was discharged, making a wound in his left leg a little below the thigh. He turned to a deadly paleness, looked at Ezra with that stunned, bewildered expression seen in the faces of those who receive a wound, and fell. By main strength the old man lifted and bore him to the house, and hurried off to the station, near which the neighborhood physician and surgeon lived. But the latter was away from home. Several hours passed before he came. The means taken to stop the hemorrhage had been ineffectual. The loss of blood had been very great. Certain foreign matter had been carried into the wound. The professional treatment was unskilful, and septic fever followed, so that for many days his life hung upon a little chance. But convalescence came at last, and with it days of clear, calm thinking. For he had not allowed news of his accident to be sent home or to his friends, and except the old couple, the doctor and the nurse whom the latter had secured, he had no company but his thoughts. No tidings had come to him of Sister Dolorosa since his accident, and nothing had intervened to remove that sad image of her which had haunted him through fever and fantasy and dream since the night of their final interview. For it was then that he had first realized in how pitiless a tragedy her life had become entangled, and how conscience may fail to govern a woman's heart in denying her the right to love, but may still govern her actions in forbidding her to marry. To plead with her had been to wound only the more deeply a nature that accepted even this pleading as a further proof of its own disloyalty, and was forced by it into a state of more poignant humiliation. What wonder, therefore, if there had been opened in his mind from that hour a certain wound which grew deeper and deeper, until, by comparison, his real wound seemed painless and insignificant. Nevertheless, it is true that during this interview he had not been able to accept her decision as irreversible. The spell of her presence over him was too complete. Even his wish to rescue her from a lot henceforth unhappier still, too urgent; so that in parting he had clung to the secret hope that little by little he might change her conscience, which now interposed the only obstacle between them. Even the next day, when he had been wounded and life was rapidly flowing from him, and earthly ties seemed soon to be snapped, he had thought only of this tie, new and sacred, and had written to her. Poor boy! He had written as with his heart's blood, his brief, pathetic appeal that she would come and be united to him before he died. In all ages of the world there have been persons, simple in nature and simple in their faith in another life, who have forgotten everything else in the last hour but the supreme wish to grapple to them those they love for eternity, and at whatever cost. Such simplicity of nature and faith belonged to him. For although in Kentucky the unrest of the century touching belief in the supernatural and the many phases by which this expresses itself are not unknown, they had never affected him. He believed, as his fathers had believed, that to be united in this world in any relation is to be united in that relation, mysteriously changed yet mysteriously the same, in another. But this letter had never been sent. There had been no one to take it at the time, and when Ezra returned with the physician he had fainted away from loss of blood. Then had followed the dressing of the wound, days of fever and unconsciousness, and then the assurance that he would get well. Thus nearly a month had passed, and for him a great change had come over the face of nature and the light of the world. With that preternatural calm of mind which only an invalid or a passionless philosopher ever obtains, he now looked back upon an episode which thus acquired fictitious remoteness. So weak that he could scarcely lift his head from his pillow, there left his heart the keen, joyous sense of human ties and pursuits. He lost the key to the motives and forces of his own character. but it is often the natural result of such illness that when the springs of feeling seem to dry up, the conscience remains sensitive, or even burns more brightly, as a star through a rarer atmosphere; so that, lying thus in the poor farmhouse during dreary days, with his life half gone out of him, and with only the sad image of her always before his eyes, he could think of nothing but this cruel folly in having broken in upon her peace; for perfect peace of some sort she must have had in comparison with what was now left her. Beneath his pillow he kept her letter, and as he often read it over he asked himself how he could ever have hoped to change the conscience which had inspired such a letter as that. If her heart belonged to him, did not her soul belong to her religion? And if one or the other must give way, could it be doubtful with such a nature as hers which would come out victorious? Thus he said to himself that any further attempt to see her could but result in greater suffering to them both, and that nothing was left him but what she herself had urged, to go away and resign her to a life from which he had too late found out that she could never be divorced. As soon as he had come to this decision, he began to think of her as belonging only to his past. The entire episode became a thing of memory, and irreparable in completeness; and with the conviction that she was lost to him, her image passed into that serene, reverential sanctuary of our common nature, where all the highest that we have grasped at and missed, and all the beauty that we have loved and lost, take the forms of statues around dim walls and look down upon us in mournful, never-changing perfection. As he lay one morning revolving his altered purpose, Ezra came quietly into the room and took from a table near the foot of the bed a waiter on which were a jelly-glass and a napkin. "She said I'd better take these back this morning," he observed, looking at Gordon for his approval, and motioning with his head towards the quarter of the house where Martha was supposed to be. "Wait a while, will you, Ezra?" he replied, looking at the old man with the dark, quiet eye of an invalid. "I think I ought to write a few lines this morning to thank them for their kindness. Come back in an hour, will you?" The things had been sent from the convent; for from the time that news had reached the Mother Superior of the accident of the young stranger who had visited the convent some days before, there had regularly come to him delicate attentions which could not have been supplied at the farmhouse. He often asked himself whether they were not inspired by her; and he thought that when the time came for him to write his thanks, he would put into the expression of them something that would be understood by her alone, something that would stand for gratitude and a farewell. When Ezra left the room, with the thought of now doing this, another thought came unexpectedly to him. By the side of the bed there stood a small table on which were writing materials and a few books that had been taken from his valise. He stretched out his hand and, opening one of them, took from it a letter which bore the address "Sister Dolorosa." It contained those appealing lines that he had written her on the day of his accident, and with calm, curious sadness he now read them over and over, as though they had never come from him. From the mere monotony of this exercise sleep overtook him, and he had scarcely restored the letter to the envelope and laid it back on the table before his eyelids closed. While he still lay asleep, Ezra came quietly into the room again and took up the waiter with the jelly-glass and the napkin. Then he looked around for the letter he was to take. He was accustomed to carry Gordon's letter to the station, and his eye now rested on the table, where they were always to be found. Seeing one on it, he walked across, took it up, and read the address, "Sister Dolorosa," hesitated, glanced at Gordon's closed eyes, and then, with an intelligent nod to signify that he could understand without further instruction, he left the room and set out briskly for the convent. Sister Dolorosa was at the cistern, filling a bucket with water, when he came up and, handing her the letter, passed on to the convent kitchen. She looked at it with indifference. Then she opened and read it, and then in an instant everything whirled before her eyes, and in her ears the water sounded loud as it dropped from the chain back into the cistern. And then she was gone, gone with a light, rapid step, down the avenue of elms, through the gate, across the meadows, out into the fields, bucket and cistern, Mother Superior and sisterhood, vows and martyrs, zeal of Carmelite, passion of Christ, all forgotten. When, nearly a month before, news had reached the Mother Superior of the young stranger's accident, in accordance with the rule which excludes from the convent worldly affairs, she had not made it known, except to those who were to aid in carrying out her kindly plans for him. To Sister Dolorosa, therefore, the accident had just occurred, and now, as she hastened to him, he was dying. During the intervening weeks she had undergone by insensible degrees a deterioration of nature. Prayer had not passed her lips. She believed that she had no right to pray. Nor had she confessed. From such a confession as she had now to make, certain new-born instincts of womanhood bade her shrink more deeply into the privacy of her own being, and therefore she had become more scrupulous, if possible, of outward duties, that no one might be led to discover the paralysis of her spiritual life. But there was that change in her which soon drew attention, and thenceforth, in order to hide her heart, she began to practice with the Mother Superior little acts of self-concealment and evasion, and by other little acts of pretense and feigning, until, God pity her, being most sorely pressed by questions, when sometimes she would be found in tears, or sitting listless with her hands in her lap, like one who is under the spell of mournful fantasies, these became other little acts of positive deception. But for each of them remorse preyed upon her the more ruthlessly, so that she grew thin and faded, with a shadow of fear darkening always her evasive eyes. What most held her apart, and most she deemed put upon her the angry ban of Heaven, was the consciousness that she still loved him, and that she was even bound to him the more inseparably since the night of their last meeting. For it was then that emotion had been awakened which drew her to him in ways that love alone could not have done. These emotions had their source in the belief that she owed him reparation for the disappointment which she had brought upon his life. The recollection of his face when she had denied him hope rose in constant reproach before her. And since she held herself blamable that he had loved her, she took the whole responsibility of his unhappiness. It was this sense of having wronged him that cleft even conscience in her and left her struggling. But how to undo the wrong? This she vainly pondered, for he was gone, bearing away into his life the burden of enticed and baffled hope. On the morning when she was at the cistern, for the Sisters of the Order have among them such interchange of manual offices, if, as she read the letter that Ezra gave her, any one motive stood out clear in the stress of that terrible moment, it was that, having been false to other duties, she might at least be true to this. She felt but one desire, to atone to him by any sacrifice of herself that would make his death more peaceful. Beyond this, everything was void and dark within her as she hurried on, except the consciousness that by this act she separated herself from her order and terminated her religious life in utter failure and disgrace. The light, rapid step with which she had started soon brought her across the fields. As she drew near the house, Martha, who had caught sight of her figure through the window, made haste to the door and stood waiting her. Sister Dolorosa merely approached and said, "Where is he?" For a moment the old woman did not answer. Then she pointed to a door at the opposite end of the porch, and with a sparkle of peculiar pleasure in her eyes, she saw Sister Dolorosa cross and enter it. A little while longer she stood, watching the keyhole furtively, but then went back to the fireside, where she sat upright and motionless, with the red flannel pushed back from her listening ears. The room was dimly lighted through half-closed shutters. Gordon lay asleep near the edge of the bed, with his face turned towards the door. It might well have been thought the face of one dying. Her eyes rested on it a moment, and then, with a stifled sob and moan, she glided across the room and sank on her knees at the bedside. In the utter self-forgetfulness of her remorse, pity, and love, she put one arm around his neck. She buried her face close beside his. He had awaked, bewildered, as he saw her coming towards him. He now took her arm from around his neck, pressed her hand again and again to his lips, and then, laying it on his heart, crossed his arms over it, letting one of his hands rest on her head. For a little while he could not trust himself to speak. His love threatened to overmaster his self-renunciation. But then, not knowing why she had come, unless from some great sympathy for his sufferings, or perhaps to see him once more, since he was now soon to go away, and not understanding any cause for her distress but the tragedy in which he had entangled her life, feeling only sorrow for her sorrow, and wishing only by means of his last words to help her back to such peace as she might win, he said to her with immeasurable gentleness, "I thought you would never come. I thought I should have to go away without seeing you again. They tell me it is not yet a month since the accident, but it seems to me so long, a lifetime. I have lain here day after day thinking it over, and I see things differently now, so differently. That is why I wanted to see you once more. I wanted you to understand that I felt you had done right in refusing to marry me. I wanted to ask you never to blame yourself for what has happened, never to let any thought of having made me unhappy add to the sorrow of your life. It is my fault, not yours. But I meant it, God knows I meant it, for the happiness of us both. I believed that your life was not suited to you. I meant to make you happy. But since you cannot give up your life, I have only been unkind. And since you think it wrong to give it up, I am glad that you are so true to it. If you must live it, Heaven only knows how glad I am that you will live it heroically. And Heaven keep me equally true to the duty in mine, that I also shall not fail in it. If we never meet again, we can always think of each other as living true to ourselves and to one another. Don't deny me this. Let me believe that your thoughts and prayers will always follow me. Even your vows will not deny me this. It will always keep us near each other, and it will bring us together where they cannot separate us." He had spoken with entire repression of himself, in the slow voice of an invalid, and on the stillness of the room each word had fallen with hard distinctness. But now, with the thought of losing her, by a painful effort he moved closer to the edge of the bed, put his arms around her neck, drew her face against his own, and continued, "But do not think it is easy to tell you this. Do not think it is easy to give you up. Do not think that I do not love you. Oh, Pauline, not in another life, but in this, in this." He could say no more, and out of his physical weakness tears rose to his eyes and fell drop by drop upon her veil. End of Chapter 7. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 of Sister Dolorosa by James Lane Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Sister Dolorosa had been missed from the convent. There had been inquiry growing ever more anxious, and search growing ever more hurried. They found her bucket overturned at the cistern, and near it the print of her feet in the moist earth. But she was gone. They sought her in every hidden closet. They climbed to the observatory and scanned the surrounding fields. Work was left unfinished, prayer unended, as the news spread through the vast building. And as time went by and nothing was heard of her, uneasiness became alarm, and alarm became a vague, immeasurable foreboding of ill. Each now remembered how strange of late had been Sister Dolorosa's life and actions, and no one had the heart to name her own particular fears to any other or to read them in any other's eyes. Time passed on, and discipline in the convent was forgotten. They began to pour out into the long corridors, and in tumultuous groups passed this way and that, seeking the Mother Superior. But the Mother Superior had gone to the church with the same impulse that in all ages had brought the human heart to the altar of God, when stricken by peril or disaster, and into the church they also gathered. Into the church likewise came the white flock of the novices, who had burst from their isolated quarter of the convent with a sudden contagion of fear. When, therefore, the Mother Superior rose from where she had been kneeling, turned, and in the dark church saw them assembled close around her, pallid, anxious, disordered, and looking with helpless dependence to her for that assurance for which she had herself in helpless dependence looked to God, so unnerved was she by the spectacle that strength failed her, and she sank upon the steps of the altar, stretching out her arms once more in voiceless supplication towards the altar of the infinite helpfulness. But at that moment a little novice, whom Sister Dolorosa loved and whom she had taught the music of the harp, came running into the church, wringing her hands and crying. When she was halfway down the aisle, in a voice that rang through the building, she called out, "Oh, Mother, she is coming! Something has happened to her! Her veil is gone!" And turning again, she ran out of the church. They were hurrying after her when a note of command, inarticulate but imperious, from the Mother Superior arrested every foot and drew every eye in that direction. Voice had failed her, but with a gesture full of dignity and reproach she waved them back, and supporting her great form between two of the nuns, she advanced slowly down the aisle of the church and passed out by the front entrance. But they forgot to obey her and followed, and when she descended the steps to the bottom and made a sign that she would wait there, on the steps behind they stood grouped and crowded back to the sacred doors. Yes, she was coming up the avenue of elms, coming slowly as though her strength were almost gone. As she passed under the trees on one side of the avenue, she touched their trunks, one by one, for support. She walked with her eyes on the ground, and with the abstraction of one who has lost the purpose of walking. When she was perhaps halfway up the avenue, as she paused by one of the trees and supported herself against it, she raised her eyes and saw them all waiting to receive her on the steps of the church. For a little while she stood and surveyed the scene, the Mother Superior standing in front, her sinking form supported between two Sisters, her hands clasping the crucifix to her bosom. Behind her the others, step above step, back to the doors, some looking at her with frightened eyes, others with their heads buried on each other's shoulders, and hiding somewhere in the throng the little novice, only the sound of whose sobbing revealed her presence. Then she took her hand from the tree, walked on quite steadily until she was several yards away, and paused again. She had torn off her veil, and her head was bare and shining. She had torn the sacred symbol from her bosom, and through the black rent they could see the glistening whiteness of her naked breast. Comprehending them in one glance, as though she wished them all to listen, she looked into the face of the Mother Superior, and began to speak in a voice utterly forlorn, as of one who has passed the limits of suffering. "Mother, Mother!" She passed one hand slowly across her forehead to brush away some cloud from her brain, and for the third time she began to speak. "Mother!" Then she paused, pressed both palms quickly to her temples, and turned her eyes in bewildered appeal towards the Mother Superior. But she did not fall. With a cry that might have come from the heart of the boundless pity, the Mother Superior broke away from the restraining arms of the nuns and rushed forward and caught her to her bosom. Chapter IX. The day had come when Gordon was well enough to go home. As he sat giving directions to Ezra, who was awkwardly packing his valise, he looked over the books, papers, and letters that lay on the table near the bed. "There is one letter missing," he said, with a troubled expression, as he finished his search. Then he added quickly, in a tone of helpless entreaty, "You couldn't have taken it to the station and mailed it with the others, could you, Ezra? It was not to go to the station. It was to have gone to the convent." The last sentence he uttered rather to his own thought than for the ear of his listener. "I took it to the convent," said Ezra stoutly, raising himself from over the valise in the middle of the floor. "I didn't take it to the station." Gordon wheeled on him, giving a wrench to his wound which may have caused the groan that burst from him, and left him white and trembling. "You took it to the convent? Great God, Ezra! When?" "The day you told me to take it," replied Ezra simply. "The day the Sister came to see you." "Oh, Ezra!" he cried piteously, looking into the rugged, faithful countenance of the old man, and feeling that he had not the right to censure him. Now for the first time he comprehended the whole significance of what had happened. He had never certainly known what motives had brought her to him that day. He had never been able to understand why, having come, she had gone away with such abruptness. Scarcely had he begun to speak to her when she had strangely shrunk from him, and scarcely had he ceased speaking when she had left the room without a word, and without his having so much as seen her face. Slowly now the sad truth forced itself upon his mind that she had come in answer to his entreaty. She must have thought his letter just written, himself just wounded and dying. It was as if he had betrayed her into the utmost expression of her love for him, and in that moment had coldly admonished her of her duty. For him she had broken what was the most sacred obligation of her life, and in return he had given her an exhortation to be faithful to her vows. He went home, to one of the older secluded country places of the Blue Grass region, not far from Lexington. His illness served to account for a strange gravity and sadness of nature in him. When the winter had passed and spring had come, bringing perfect health again, his sadness only deepened, for health had brought back the ardor of life. The glowing colors of the world returned, and with these there flowed back into his heart, as waters flow back into a well that has gone dry, the perfect love of youth and strength with which he had loved her and tried to win her at first. And with this love of her came back the first complete realization that he had lost her, and with this pain, that keenest pain of having been most unkind to her when he had striven to be kindest. He now looked back upon his illness as one who has gained some clear headland looks down upon a valley so dark and overhung with mist that he cannot trace his own course across it. He was no longer in sympathy with that mood of self-renunciation which had influenced him in their last interview. He charged himself with having given up too easily, for might he not, after all, have won her? Might he not, little by little, have changed her conscience, as little by little he had gained her love? Would it have been possible, he asked himself again and again, for her ever to have come to him as she had done that day? Had not her conscience approved? Of all his torturing thoughts, none caused him greater suffering than living over in imagination what must have happened to her since then, the humiliation, perhaps public exposure, followed by penalties and sorrows of which he durst not think, and certainly a life more unrelieved in gloom and desolation. In the summer his father's health began to fail, and in the autumn he died. The winter was passed in settling the business of the estate, and before the spring passed again, Gordon found himself at the head of affairs, and stretching out before him, calm and clear, the complete independence of his new-found manhood. His life was his own to make it what he would. As fortunes go in Kentucky, he was wealthy, his farm being among the most beautiful of the beautiful ones which make up that land, and his homestead being dear through family ties and those intimations of fireside peace which lay closest the heart of his ideal life. But amid all his happiness, that one lack which made the rest appear lacking, that vacancy within which nothing would fill. The beauty of the rich land henceforth brought him the dreamlike recollection of a rough, poor country 100 miles away. Its quiet homesteads, with the impressions they create of sweet and simple lives, reminded him only of a convent standing alone and forbidding on its wide landscape. The calm liberty of woods and fields, the bounding liberty of life, the enlightened liberty of conscience and religion, which were to him the best gifts of his state, his country, and his time, forced on him perpetual contrast with the ancient confinement in which she languished. Still he threw himself resolutely into his duties. In all that he did or planned he felt a certain sacred, uplifting force added to his life by that high bond through which he had sought to link their sundered pathways. But on the other hand, the haunting thought of what might have befallen her since became a corrosive care and began to eat out the heart of his resolute purposes. So that when the long, calm summer had passed and autumn had come, bringing him lonelier days in the brown fields, lonelier rides on horseback through the gorgeous woods, and lonelier evenings beside his rekindled hearthstones, he could bear the suspense no longer, and made up his mind to go back, if not to hear tidings whether she yet were living in the convent. He realized, of course, that under no circumstances could he ever again speak to her of his love. He had put himself on the side of her conscience against his own cause, but he felt that he owed it to himself to dissipate uncertainty regarding her fate. This done, he could return, however sadly, and take up the duties of his life with better heart. Chapter 10. One Sunday afternoon he got off at the little station. From one of the rustic loungers on the platform he learned that old Ezra and Martha had gone, the year before, to live with a son in a distant state, and that their scant acres had been absorbed in the convent domain. Slowly he took his way across the sombre fields. Once more he reached the brown footpath and the edge of the pale, thin corn. Once more the summoning whistle of the quail came sweet and clear from the depths of a neighboring thicket. Silently in the reddening west were rising the white cathedrals of the sky. It was on yonder hilltop he had first seen her, standing as though transfigured in the evening light. Overwhelmed by the memories which the place evoked, he passed on towards the convent. The first sight of it in the distance smote him with a pain so sharp that a groan escaped his lips as from a reopened wound. It was the hour of the vesper service. Entering the church, he sat where he had sat before. How still it was, how faint the autumnal sunlight stealing in through the sainted windows, how motionless the dark company of nuns seated on one side of the nave, how rigid the white rows of novices on the other. With sad fascination of search his eyes roved among the black-shrouded devotees. She was not there. In the organ loft above, a voice, poor and thin, began to pour out its wavering little tide of song. She was not there, then. Was her soul already gone home to heaven? Noiselessly from behind the altar the sacristan had come forth and began to light the candles. With eyes strained and the heart gone out of him, he hung upon the movements of her figure. A slight, youthful figure it was, slighter as though worn and wasted, and the hands which so firmly bore the long taper looked too white and fragile to have upheld aught heavier than the stalk of a lily. With infinite meekness and reverence she moved hither and thither about the shrine, as though each footfall were a step nearer the glorious presence, each breath a prayer. one by one there sprang into being, beneath her touch of love, the silvery spires of sacred flame. No angel of the night ever more softly lit the stars of heaven. And it was thus that he saw her for the last time, folded back to the bosom of that faith from which it was left him to believe that he had all but rescued her to love and happiness, and set, as a chastening admonition, to tend the mortal fires on the altar of eternal service. Looking at her across the vast estranging gulf of destiny, heartbroken, he asked himself in his poor yearning way whether she longer had any thought of him or longer loved him. For answer he had only the assurance given in her words, which now rose as a benediction in his memory. "If he will deign to hear the ceaseless, fervent petition of one so erring, he will not leave you unhappy on account of that love for me which in this world it will never be allowed me to return." One highest star of adoration she kindled last, and then turned and advanced down the aisle. He was sitting close to it, and as she came towards him, with irresistible impulse he bent forward to meet her, his lips parted as though to speak, his eyes implored her for recognition, his hands were instinctively moved to attract her notice. But she passed him with unuplifted eyes. The hem of her dress swept across his foot. In that intense moment, which compressed within itself the joy of another meeting and the despair of an eternal farewell, in that moment he may have tried to read through her face and beyond it in her very soul the story of what she must have suffered. To any one else, on her face rested only that beauty transcending all description which is born of the sorrow of earth and the peace of God. Mournful as was this last sight of her, and touched with remorse, he could yet bear it away in his heart for long remembrance not untempered by consolation. He saw her well, he saw her faithful, he saw her bearing the sorrows of her lot with angelic sweetness. Through years to come the beauty of this scene might abide with him, lifted above the realm of mortal changes by the serenitude of her immovable devotion. Chapter 11 and 12 of Sister Dolorosa by James Lane Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. There was thus spared him knowledge of the great change that had taken place regarding her within the councils of the order; nor perhaps was he ever to learn of the other changes, more eventful still, that were now fast closing in upon her destiny. When the Creator wishes to create a woman, the beauty of whose nature is to prefigure the types of an immortal world, he endows her more plenteously with the faculty of innocent love. The contravention of this faculty has time after time resulted in the most memorable tragedies that have ever saddened the history of the race. He had given to the nature of Pauline Cambron two strong, unwearying wings, the pinion of faith and the pinion of love. It was his will that she should soar by the use of both. But they had denied her the use of one, and the vain and bewildered struggle which marked her life thenceforth were as those of a bird that should try to rise into the air with one of its wings bound tight against its bosom. After the illness which followed upon the events of that terrible day, she took towards her own conduct the penitential attitude enjoined by her religion. There is little need to lay bare all that followed. She had passed out of her soft world of heroic dreams into the hard world of unheroic reality. She had chosen a name to express her sympathy with the sorrows of the world, and the sorrows of the world had broken in upon her. Out of the white dawn of the imagination she had stepped into the heat and burden of the day. Long after penance and prayers were over, and by others she might have felt herself forgiven, she was as far as ever from that forgiveness which comes from within. It is not characteristic of a nature such as hers to win pardon so easily, for such an offense of her being seemed concentred more and more in one impassioned desire to expiate her sin. For as time passed on, despite penances and prayers, she realized that she still loved him. As she pondered this, she said to herself that peace would never come unless she should go elsewhere and begin life over in some place that was free from the memories of her fall. There was so much to remind her of him. She could not go into the garden without recalling the day when they had walked through it side by side. She could not cross the threshold of the church without being reminded that it was the scene of her unfaithfulness and of her exposure. The graveyard, the footpath across the fields, the observatory, all were full of disturbing images. And therefore she besought the Mother Superior to send her away to some one of the missions of the order, thinking that thus she would win forgetfulness of him and singleness of heart. But while the plan of doing this was yet being considered by the Mother Superior, there happened one of those events which seem to fit into the crises of our lives as though determined by the very laws of fate. The attention of the civilized world had not yet been fixed upon the heroic labors of the Belgian priest, Father Damien, among the lepers of the island of Molokai. But it has been stated that near the convent are the monks of La Trappe. Among these monks were friends of the American priest, Brother Joseph, who for years was one of Father Damien's assistants. And to these friends this priest from time to time wrote letters in which he described at great length the life of the leper settlement and the work of the small band of men and women who had gone to labor in that remote and awful vineyard. The contents of these letters were made known to the ecclesiastical superior of the convent, and one evening he made them the subject of a lecture to the assembled nuns and novices, dwelling with peculiar eloquence upon the devotion of the 3 Franciscan sisters who had become outcasts from human society, that they might nurse and teach leprous girls, until inevitable death should overtake them also. Among that breathless audience of women there was one soul on whom his words fell with the force of a message from the Eternal. Here then at last was offered her a pathway, by following meekly to the end of which she might perhaps find blessedness. The real Man of Sorrows appeared to stand in it and beckon her on to the abodes of those abandoned creatures whose sufferings he had with peculiar pity so often stretched forth his hand to heal. When she laid before the Mother Superior her petition to be allowed to go, it was at first refused, being regarded as a momentary impulse. But months passed, and at intervals, always more earnestly, she renewed her request. It was pointed out to her that when one has gone among the lepers there is no return. The alternatives are either lifelong banishment or death from leprosy, usually at the end of a few years. But always her reply was, "In the name of Christ, Mother, let me go." Meantime it had become clear to the Mother Superior that some change of scene must be made. The days of Sister Dolorosa's usefulness in the convent were too plainly over. It had not been possible in that large household of women to conceal the fact of her unfaithfulness to her vows. As one black veil whispered to another, as one white veil communed with its attentive neighbor, little by little events were gathered and pieced together, until, in different forms of error and rumor, the story became known to all. Some from behind window lattices had watched her in the garden with the young stranger on the day of his visiting the convent. Others had heard of his lying wounded at the farmhouse. Still others were sure that under pretext of visiting old Martha she had often met him in the fields. And then the scene on the steps of the church, when she had returned, soiled and torn and fainting. so that from the day on which she arose from her illness and began to go about the convent, she was singled out as a target for those small arrows which the feminine eye directs with such faultless skill at one of its own sex. With scarcely perceptible movements they would draw aside when passing her, as though to escape corrupting contact. Certain ones of the younger sisters, who were jealous of her beauty, did not fail to drop innuendoes for her to overhear; and upon some of the novices, whose minds were still wavering between the Church and the world, it was thought that her example might have a dangerous influence. It is always wrong to judge motives, but it is possible that the head of the order may have thought it best that this ruined life should take on the halo of martyrdom, from which fresh lustre would be reflected upon the annals of the Church. However this may be, after about 18 months of waiting, during which correspondence was held with the Sandwich Islands, it was determined that Sister Dolorosa should be allowed to go thither and join the labors of the Franciscan Sisters. From the day when consent was given, she passed into that peace with which one ascends the scaffold or awaits the stake. It was this look of peace that Gordon had seen on her face as she moved hither and thither about the shrine. Only a few weeks after he had thus seen her, the day came for her to go. Of those who took part in the scene of farewell, she was the most unmoved. A month later she sailed from San Francisco for Honolulu, and in due time there came from Honolulu to the Mother Superior the following letter. It contains all that remains of the earthly history of Pauline Cambron. Chapter 12. Kalawao, Molokai, Hawaiian Islands, January 1, 18 Dear Mother, I entreat you not to let the sight of this strange handwriting, instead of one that must be so familiar, fill you with too much alarm. I hasten to assure you that before my letter closes you will understand why Sister Dolorosa has not written herself. Since the hour when the vessel sailed from the American port, bearing to us that young life as a consecrated helper in our work among these suffering outcasts of the human race, I know that your thoughts and prayers have followed her with unceasing anxiety. So that first I should give you tidings that the vessel reached Honolulu in safety. I should tell you also that she had a prosperous voyage, and that she is now happy, far happier than when she left you. I know likewise that your imagination has constantly hovered about this island, and that you have pictured it to yourself as the gloomiest of all spots in the universe of God, so that in the next place I should try to remove this impression by giving you some description of the island itself, which has now become her unchanging home. The island of Molokai, then, on which the leper settlement has been located by the government, is long and shaped much like the leaf of the willow tree. The Sandwich Islands, as you well know, are a group of volcanoes out of which the fires have for the most part long since died. Molokai, therefore, is really but a mountain of cooled lava, half of which, perhaps, is beneath the level of the sea. The two leper villages are actually situated in the cup of an ancient crater. The island is very low along the southern coast, and slopes gradually to its greatest altitude on the northern ridge, from which the descent to the sea is in places all but perpendicular. It is between the bases of these northern cliffs and the sea that the villages are built. In the rear of them is a long succession of towering precipices and wild ravines that are solemn and terrible to behold, and in front of them there is a coastline so rough with pointed rocks that as the waves rush in upon them, spray is often thrown to the height of 50 or 100 feet. It is this that makes the landing at times so dangerous, and at other times, when a storm has burst, so fatal. So that shipwrecks are not unknown, dear Mother, and sometimes add to the sadness of life in this place. But from this description you would only get a mistaken idea of the aspect of the island. It is sunny and full of tropical loveliness. The lapse of centuries has in places covered the lava with exquisite verdure. Soft breezes blow here. About the dark cliffs hang purple atmospheres, and above them drift pink and white clouds. Sometimes the whole island is veiled in golden mist. Beautiful streams fall down its green precipices into the sea, and the sea itself is of the most brilliant blue. In its depths are growths of pure white corals, which are the homes of fishes of gorgeous colors. If I should speak no longer of the island, but of the people, I could perhaps do something further still to dissipate the dread with which you and other strangers must regard us. The inhabitants are a simple, generous, happy race, and there are many spots in this world, many in Europe and Asia, perhaps some in your own land, where the scenes of suffering and death are more poignant and appalling. The lepers live for the most part in decent white cottages. Many are the happy faces that are seen among them. So that, strange as it may seem, healthy people would sometimes come here to live if the laws did not forbid. So much has Christianity done that one may now be buried in consecrated ground. If all this appears worldly and frivolous, dear mother, forgive me. If I have chosen to withhold from you news of her, of whom alone I know you are thinking, it is because I have wished to give you as bright a picture as possible. Perhaps you will thus become the better prepared for what is to follow. So that before I go further, I shall pause again to describe to you one spot which is the loveliest on the island. About 1.5 miles from the village of Coelho, there is a rocky point which is used as an irregular landing place when the sea is wild. Just beyond this point there is an inward curve of the coast, making an inlet of the sea, and from the water's edge there slopes backward into the bosom of the island a deep ravine. Down this ravine there falls and winds a gleaming white cataract, and here the tropical vegetation grows most beautiful. The trees are wreathed with moist creepers. The edges and crevices of the lava blocks are fringed with ferns and moss. Here the wild ginger blooms and the crimson lehua. Here grow trees of orange and palm and panhala groves. Here one sees the rare honey bird with its plumage of scarlet velvet, the golden plover, and the beautiful white boson bird wheeling above the black cliff heights. The spot is as beautiful as a scene in some fairy tale. When storms roll in from the sea, the surf flows far back into this ravine, and sometimes, after the waters have subsided, a piece of wreckage from the ocean is left behind. Forgive me once more, O dear mother, if again I seem to you so idle and unmeaning in my words, but I have found it almost impossible to go on. And besides, I think you will thank me, after you have read my letter through, for telling you first of this place. From the day of our first learning that there was a young spirit among you who had elected, for Christ's sake, to come here and labor with us, we had counted the days till she should arrive. The news had spread throughout the leper settlement. Father Damien had made it known to the lepers in Kilawao. Father Wendelin had likewise told it among the lepers at Kalapaupa, and the Protestant ministers spoke of it to their flocks. Thus her name had already become familiar to hundreds of them, and many a prayer had been offered up for her safety. Once a week there comes to Molokai from Honolulu a little steamer called Mokolii. When it reached here last Saturday morning it brought the news that just before it sailed from Honolulu the vessel bearing Sister Dolorosa had come into port. She had been taken in charge by the Sisters until the Mokolii should return and make the next trip. I should add that the steamer leaves at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that it usually reaches here at about dawn of the following morning in ordinary weather. And now, dear mother, I beseech you to lay my letter aside. Do not read further now. Lay it aside, and do not take it up again until you have sought in prayer the consolation of our divine religion for the sorrows of our lives. I shall believe that you have done this, and that as you now go on with the reading of my letter, you have gained the fortitude to hear what I have scarcely the power to write. Heaven knows that in my poor way I have sought to prepare you. As it was expected that the steamer would reach the island about dawn on Saturday morning, as usual it had been arranged that many of us should be at the landing place to give her welcome. But about midnight one of the terrific storms which visit this region suddenly descended, enveloping the heavens, that had been full of the light of the stars, in impenetrable darkness. We were sleepless with apprehension that the vessel would be driven upon the rocks, such was the direction of the storm, long before it could come opposite the villages. And a few hours before the day, Father Damien, accompanied by Father Conradi, Brother James, and Brother Joseph, went down to the coast. Through the remaining hours of the night they watched and waited, now at one point and now at another, knowing that the vessel could never land in such a storm. As the dawn broke, they followed up the coast until they came opposite the rocky point of which I have already spoken as being an irregular landing place. Here they were met by 2 or 3 men who were drenched with the sea and just starting towards the villages, and from them they learned that an hour or 2 before the steamer had been driven upon the hidden rocks of the point. It had been feared that it would soon be sunk or dashed to pieces, and as quickly as possible a boat had been put off, in which were the leper girls that were being brought from Honolulu. There was little hope that it would ever reach the shore, but it was the last chance of life. In this boat, dear Mother, Sister Dolorosa also was placed. Immediately afterwards a second boat was put off, containing the others that were on board. Of the fate of the first boat they had learned nothing. Their own had been almost immediately capsized, and so far as they knew, they were the sole survivors. The Hawaiians are the most expert of swimmers, being almost native to the sea, and since the distance was short and only these survived, you will realize how little chance there was for any other. During the early hours of the morning, which broke dark and inexpressibly sad for us, a few bodies were found washed ashore, among them those of 2 leper girls of Honolulu. But our search for her long proved unavailing. At length Father Damien suggested that we follow up the ravine which I have described, and it was thither that he and Brother Joseph and I accordingly went. Father Damien thought it well that I should go with them. It was far inland, dear Mother, that at last we found her. She lay outstretched on a bare black rock of lava, which sloped upward from the sea. Her naked white feet rested on the green moss that fringed its lower edge, and her head was sheltered from the burning sun by branches of ferns. Almost over her eyes, the lids of which were stiff with the salt of the ocean, there hung a spray of white poppies. It was as though nature would be kind to her in death. At the sight of her face, so young and having in it the purity and the peace of heaven, we knelt down around her without a word, and for a while we could do nothing but weep. Surely nothing so spotless was ever washed ashore on this polluted island. If I sinned, I pray to be forgiven, but I found a strange joy in thinking that the corruption of this terrible disease had never been laid upon her. Heaven had accepted in advance her faithful spirit, and had spared her the long years of bodily suffering. At Father Damien's direction, Brother Joseph returned to the village for a bier, and for 4 lepers who would be strong enough to bear it. When they came, we laid her on it and bore her back to the village, where Mother Marianne took the body in charge and prepared it for burial. How shall I describe her funeral? The lepers were her pallbearers. The news of the shipwreck had quickly spread throughout the settlement, and those simple, generous people yield themselves so readily to the emotion of the hour. When the time arrived, it seemed that all who could walk had come to follow her to the churchyard. It was a moving sight, the long, wavering train of that death-stricken throng, whose sufferings had so touched the pity of our Lord when He was on earth, and the desolation of whose fate she had come to lessen. There were the young and the old alike, Protestants and Catholics without distinction, children with their faces so strangely aged with ravages of the leprosy, those advanced in years with theirs so mutilated and marred. Others upon whom the leprosy had made such advances that they were too weak to walk, sat in their cottage doors and lifted their husky voices in singing that wailing native hymn in which they bemoaned their hopeless fate. Some of the women, after a fashion of their own, wore large wreaths of blue blossoms and green leaves about their withered faces. And it was thus that we lepers, I say we lepers because I am one of them, since I cannot expect long to escape the disease, it was thus that we lepers followed her to the graveyard in the rock by the blue sea, where Father Damien with his own hands had helped to dig her grave. And there, dear mother, all that is mortal of her now rests. But we know that ere this she has heard the words, "I was sick, and ye visited me." Mother Marianne would herself have written, but she was called away to the leproserie. Sister Agatha. End of Chapter 12. End of Sister Dolorosa, by James Lane Allen.